On this AIRCHECK episode, it's part one of our four-part series with Barry Scott, founder and host of the national syndicated radio show, The Lost 45's.
Barry takes us back to 1982 when he attended Emerson College in Boston and launched the Lost 45's radio show, how he caught the attention of some radio trade publications. He tells a story how his middle school teacher first exposed him to one of those trade publications in class, which became the catalyst to his career, plus his time at an alphabet list of Boston radio stations.
Let's go.
Welcome to AIRCHECK Season 4, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities, managers, consultants, owners, and your most humble hosts from Philadelphia, Rich DeSisto and Paul Kelly.
I'm Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Paul Kelly.
This is the first of a four-part series with Barry Scott, founder and host of the syndicated radio show, The Lost 45's.
Lost 45's, the best music of our lives. Those songs from back then, we can listen to once again.
From Boston's Emerson College to prominent Boston radio stations, Barry tells the story of the launch of his specialty show from WERS to the start of his FM radio career, which included WBCN.
Boston is the home of the four-letter word that means rock. WBCN.
Kiss 108.
Everybody knows who plays today's Kiss music.
108.
WXKS-FM, Medford, Boston.
The Chancellor Media Corporation station.
Number one for today's hit music.
WCOZ.
84.5 FM, WCOZ, Boston. We just rock and roll.
WZLX.
Boston's best variety of classics. 100.7 WCLX.
And Mix 98.5.
For the best variety of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, listen to Mix 98.5.
His interview with Roberta Flack, what it means to be a radio puker.
We're back! Joey Mack just tried to grab my wiener. No kidding! I think he's into me!
And we're back! Folks, Dirty Dad just pooped on his own wiener. He's got a poop wiener.
And the unfortunate story of when race became an issue with the music he was playing.
I was told that I shouldn't play any music by black artists, was the way it was put. And I said, I don't know how that's possible. This is top 40 music from the 70s, and the stylistics, and you know, they're all part of it.
Here he is, with a record player under one arm and a wagon of 45s towing behind him. Please put your hands together and welcome, from the Lost 45's, Barry Scott.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Barry, the Lost 45's. This is a show that is just amazing, and we're going to talk a lot about the show, its origins and things like that. It's obviously all about the music, but you've got a music teacher that helped get your feet rolling on just being in that direction. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
My middle school music teacher from 6th grade to 8th grade was the person who exposed me to my first Billboard Hot 100. I don't know how she did it, but she had a subscription to Billboard as a middle school music teacher, which I don't know how they passed that as a line item back then. And she would hang the top 100 every week. And at the end of music class, which largely consisted of listening to Jesus Christ Superstar or Beatles or story songs and trying to understand stories in music, which was kind of neat, I would stand and watch and look at every song on that top 100. She noticed that. And at the end of the week, she presented me with her finished Billboard magazine.
That's true. I was a middle school music teacher, general music and choral director, and we did get a subscription to Billboard magazine every week, and I posted on the door to my room the top 40, and Barry would have to come over and look at it every single week to see what was going up and what was going down on the charts. At the end of the week, when I was finished with the subscription, I gave it to Barry. I think that's what started Barry on his whole path of looking for interesting music.
So starting from the age of 13, I read Billboard from cover to cover. Before I even knew what radio jargon was, I learned about radio formats and programming and music and the different charts from adult contemporary to hits of the world. And I don't know, I pretty much memorized them. So I dedicated my first book to her. We Had Joy, We Had Fun, which was about recording artists from the 70s. And I told Roberta Flack this story because Roberta Flack was one of the many music stars who were teachers to begin with. And she was so touched by it, she sent a little note for me to forward on to my teacher.
It's a very, very important thing that people like yourself and like your teacher who inspired you are around, because otherwise there would be no moments of great joy and peace and beauty and memories. It's a wonderful thing. There's no way to substitute the experience that happens for the receiver of a music idea, a music lesson, a music thought, the student, and the teacher who has the opportunity to deliver it. It's just incredible.
So I can't underestimate the power of that woman exposing me to the charts. And by then I already knew what I wanted to do. So it was great to have that experience.
Awesome. For the listeners that don't know about your show, The Lost 45's, it's a specialty show, and we've got listeners say, well, what's a specialty show? These are the shows that you sometimes hear on weekends on radio stations. You hear countdown shows and things like that, but describe yours and how unique that it is.
Well, I was probably prepping for my show since I was 5. I do have an AIRCHECK that basically is me at 5 years old announcing Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. And some marches, and including one, and Do You Love Me, and one song in the wrong speed, where I just go, oops, which is pretty much what any grown jock would do. But so I never really wanted to do anything else. In elementary school, I think it is, maybe it was later on, they give you an aptitude test. And while everybody around me got lawyer or doctor, believe it or not, I got radio announcer.
Wow.
So I don't think I wanted anything else. And when I got to college at Emerson in Boston, in order to get on WERS, their FM signal there, you had to propose something that was different.
Tell them what you want to say, Dinky.
We are WERS Boston, providing 35 years of excellence in broadcasting.
And you know it, the special edition is a part of it on FM 88.9.
And believe it or not, in 1981, different was the decade of the 70s. Nobody was playing it in 1981. It was totally overlooked. So that's what I did. I started a show. It was then called The Gold Rush, and it was on for 4 years. And by my junior year, it was apparent that the songs from the 70s that got the most attention, I started calling them Lost 45's. And it was Partridge Family and Bobby Sherman and Helen Reddy and Tony Orlando and Dawn, still staples on the show. The songs that the minute they left the top 40, they were forgotten, but obviously not by people who grew up with them. And by the graduation time in my senior year, I had gotten an incredible amount of press from Billboard. They printed a top 100 of mine, Radio and Records, Friday Morning Quarterback, the Boston Herald, the Boston Globe, and that enabled me to get my first big boys job right out of college.
So as you're talking about all these Lost 45's as the precursor to putting this show together back in those early 80s days when, MTV came on the scene and kind of, put focus on a different style of music and pushed the 80s a little bit more in a forward direction. And you're looking back to those records, those one-hit wonders, if you will. I think about, the 45's that I purchased along the way in my youth, and, standing, at that rack in the, Sam Goody of those days, or the wall-to-wall sound, or whatever the store was back then, Tower Records, and just flipping through and buying my first 45. Do you remember your very first 45 that you purchased as a kid?
First 45 I bought, I was probably about 6, maybe 5. I heard Leaving on a Jet Plane by Peter, Paul, and Mary.
So kiss me and smile for me. Tell me that you'll wait for me. Hold me like you'll never let me go.
I was living in the Hartford area, and I clearly remember a little transistor radio. When I held it just right, it got WHYN AM in Springfield, Mass.
The best show in Springfield, WHYN.
And Living on a Jet Plane was playing, and I remember tilting it so it would just stay in. And growing up in Newington, Connecticut, right outside of Hartford, I was able to get Boston radio clearly, and I was able to get New York radio clearly, aside from my favorite Hartford stations. And so I was able to hear all of those charts and listening to all those songs. But I bought Leaving on a Jet Plane. I remember it Green Warner Brothers label. I remember John Denver wrote it, and I didn't know who John Denver was. It told you what album it came from. It told you who arranged and produced it, what time it was. And I read everything on there. I even played the flip side, because if I was going to spend 69 cents at Bradley's or Zayre or Kmart, I was going to hear both sides. And it turns out a lot of the artists appreciate that when you tell them. I was talking to Ron Altbach, who was in King Harvest. And obviously Dancing in the Moonlight's now a staple, although it was once a Lost 45 when my show began. And the flip side is called Marty and the Captain.
Oh, Marty and the Captain, they're surely fine old friends. They've been working on their boat now since who knows when.
And I always loved it. And I told him, and he said that was the song that he wrote that he wanted to push, but the label wanted Dancing in the Moonlight. So you get interesting stories about the flip sides. Probably the most interesting one is the flip side of Seasons in the Sun, which is one of my biggest Lost 45s by Terry Jacks. And I'm 10 years old when I bought that.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in the sun.
And the flip side's called Put the Bone In.
Put the bone in, she asked him at the store. 'Cause my doggy's been hit by a car.
The lyrics are Put the Bone In, she asked him at the store, 'cause my doggy's been hit by a car. And when you're 10, that's like a story song. So years later, one of my first interviews, which got the ball rolling for my 1,000 interviews, was with Terry Jacks. I located him on a boat off of the coast of Canada. The boat was called Seasons in the Sun. And I asked him about the song, and I said, I loved it. I used to sing it to my family. And when we had steak or pork chops, I would hand my plate to my mother and say, put the bone in. Well,
the record company wanted you to put something on the back that was a throwaway, so you recorded a song called Put the Bone In. Tell us more about that song. Is it really a nice little song about a dog who gets hit by a car?
Put the bone in. I figured, well, nobody's going to play that thing. But you wouldn't believe the jukebox play I get on that. I get a lot of the country towns.
Well, it's under 2 minutes. It's nice and quick. What's it about?
Well, you'll have to figure that out. It's just kind of a fun song. In the chorus, I had a lot of Vancouver Canucks, our hockey team, came down to the studio and just sang one part of the chorus right in the middle.
It's as you can imagine, as now an adult, it's a very dirty song. The Canucks sing on it. It's a bar ditty. And there you go with one of the fun flip sides from my youth.
Put the bone in, she begged him as she paced around the floor. Put the bone in, she yelled out once more.
This is an AIRCHECK Rewind, Season 2. Danny Bonaducci.
He's 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, and I'm 5'6", and at the time I fought him, I was 158. So theoretically, he was in charge of the fight, if you will. So when I saw how terrified Barry Williams, Greg Brady was, I tried to carry him, but he's so much bigger than me, the audience could tell, and they started booing. And when they started booing, I just dropped him. He hits the floor. They drag him to his corner. We wait a minute, 2 minutes, whatever. And then they say, how you feeling? He goes, oh, I'm all right. And they said, good. And they threw him back in the ring.
AIRCHECK, a podcast about radio's personality from Radio Personalities. Seasons 1 and 2 available now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. You can also listen on your smart speaker. Just say, Alexa, play AIRCHECK Podcast, or OK Google, play AIRCHECK Podcast.
Barry, who was the first station that gave you your break? I mean, you did this revolutionary show at Emerson College. You graduate, and all right, now where am I going? I have my passion. Who said, come on in, come work for me?
When I was at Emerson, besides being on the FM station and the AM station, I did a lot of internships. I did a BCN internship with Mark Parento on the listener line.
It's Mike Parento, weekday afternoons beginning at 3, only on the station that gives you classic rock, modern rock, at Mark, 104.1 WBCN Boston.
If you're an Aerosmith fan, stay tuned.
I went to KISS 108 and worked under Sonny Joe White, who taught me so much about programming and so much about making radio stand out, be up to date. He told me, even if you're playing oldies, try to be up to date.
KISS 108 FM, Sonny Joe White.
This lady was in town a couple of weeks ago, and we saw her on Channel 4, saw her with Joyce on Live on 4. Her name is Cyndi Lauper. She mentioned then that this song would be out. We got one of the first copies of it. It's on the LP. Hot from that LP, the Cyndi Lauper remix of Bebop. It's 108.
And he also showed me how to do some sparkle and flash. I mean, Sonny was all about sparkle and flash, and that's what Kiss 108 built its heritage on. And from there, I got an internship at COZ. I was there the day that they changed from kick-ass rock and roll.
Rock and roll radio in Boston. 94.5 FM, WCOZ.
I came in one morning and they were dubbing Automatic by the Pointer Sisters. And so that was my first format change. They went hot AC a couple years before that was even a cool thing.
The switch is on to the new all-hit Z94.
I like the hits, so I made the switch.
The switch is on.
I switched to the new all-hit Z94.
When I'm not listening to him, I switched to the new all-hit, the Z94.
I made the switch to the new all-hit Z94.
The new all-hit Z94. The switch is on.
And then I went to ZLX. When I joined ZLX, they were WKKT, the cat. Probably the worst jingles I'd ever heard. They used to go meow, meow, meow. And it was just a horrific station, but I ran the board in the morning. They didn't have any jocks. And I also happened to be there. And the day they changed to ZLX, and I walked in one day and they were doing Motown 60s and 70s.
Classic Hits 100.7, WZLX, Boston.
And Gary Guthrie was the PD. Now, Gary is legendary because he took Neil Diamond's You Don't Bring Me Flowers and combined it with Barbara's You Don't Bring Me Flowers and edited them together. And when Columbia Records heard about it, they put Neil and Barbara together, and he got a gold record award for starting that song.
Well, now we're about to hear the one most popular single of the week, but it's not going to be the real thing. It's the duet by Barbra Streisand and Neil Diamond, You Don't Bring Me Flowers, returning to the #1 spot. And I think everybody knows the story by now of how program director Gary Guthrie at station WAKY in Louisville brought Neil and Barbara together. He edited their 2 solo recordings of that song into a duet, and he made it a hit in Louisville.
So he was the first classic hits PD. As far as I know, he started the format. It didn't exist before that. And he was targeting baby boomers. I brought him in all the information on my show. I've never had, or do I have, a particular radio big booming jock voice. And I think it took some selling for him. And eventually, I think he realized that I was as ordinary as the records I was playing. I mean, you can't really introduce Bo Donaldson and the Haywoods, Billy Don't Be a Hero these days in a puking voice. I mean, it's really the whole idea is that I'm someone who loved these tunes when I was growing up, and I'm taking them out of my record collection and playing them for someone, and puking through it just doesn't really make sense. So he gave me a slot eventually. I think it took 6 months of begging him, but he gave me a slot. It was 10 to midnight on Sunday night. And the response was so phenomenal that it was 9 to midnight within the 3 or 4 weeks. It was 8 to midnight, and then it moved to 7 to 11, where it was on for a decade. So that's how I got started at ZLX. And I was there. I was also their promotions marketing director. So I was, that was my first big boy job. And I stayed there for 8 years.
Barry, we might have a couple of listeners who are wondering, why is this guy sick to his stomach and puking? Can you explain that to somebody that has no idea what puking means? And then give us an example.
Well, some of the boss jocks that I grew up with used to puke a lot. I mean, if you listen to New York radio especially, that was the thing.
Our idea of what it might sound like if 2 top 40 DJs met and talked on the street.
Well, blast my rock and roll top 40 Sullivans and Ronnie Landry, the hit playing fun devil from the land of wall-to-wall music.
Leaping lizards and golly wow, it's Blue-Eyed Bob, the teeny bopper's daddy-o of the radio.
Still playing stacks of wax at the greatest little station that they
I admire them. I grew up with them. I love some of them. I mean, God, Dan Ingram was one of my favorite jocks of all time. So it was a thing in the 70s, and I'm sure they puked before They Don't Be a Hero in that radio voice, the kind of radio voice they make fun of in Family Guy a lot, I'd say.
In 3, 2, 1. This is the lunch hour with your host. Hey, what's up, Quahog? From the station that reaches the beaches, you're listening to Dingo and the Baby.
Dingo and the Baby, 97.1 Quahog.
Oh, baby. What the hell are you doing? What the hell does that have to do with anything? They're just wacky sounds, to liven things up.
D-I-N-G-O.
But that isn't really a thing anymore. And I didn't want it to be, nor could I, with my voice, emulate that. So I went another way. And I have jumped into a cab in Boston. And just by saying an address, the cab driver has said, "You're Barry Scott." I was at Fenway Park one day, and the people behind me said, "We heard you talking. Do you do the Lost 45 show?" So this voice, especially during the diaries that you had to write down and remember, people remembered my voice. And I think that's why the show did so well.
So you were walking into these radio stations and getting to do your show. It wasn't you walking in and saying, "All right, Barry, here's the format, follow the scheduled music list, and away we go."
Well, Paul, I count my blessings for that. I know it's unusual. I know a lot of people at Emerson went to school thinking that they were going to be in radio and they were going to create their own shows like they did in college. I'm one of the few people who actually got to do that. And I don't think I ever took it for granted. There was always an eye when doing my show, and depending who was my PD, on keeping it hit driven, on making sure that I didn't go overboard in any direction or play anything that was way too obscure or anything that was inappropriate. And I got in trouble a few times from program directors who didn't quite get it, and some that really had philosophies that were horrific. I'll give you an example. I won't name names, but at one of my radio stations in Boston, I was told one morning, I was called into the PD chair, and I was told that I shouldn't play any music by black artists, was the way it was put. And I said, I don't know how that's possible. This is top 40 music from the 70s, and the stylistics, and they're all part of it. But I will try. So the next week I got called in again. I told you not to play any black artists, and last night you played Casey and the Sunshine Band. And I said, well, besides the fact that Casey's white and that's an interracial group, and by this point, the show was so successful, it was actually more successful than the station that it was on. Wow. I had a 15 chair, and they were struggling to get a 2 or 3. So I said, let me just pick the phone up right now, call the Boston Herald, because as a marketing director for so many years, I had good connections. And I said, I'm going to let them know that you don't want to hear black music on your station. And he backtracked a bit, but right then and there, I knew I needed to leave. And I called Greg Strassel, who had just started Mix 98.5 at the time. And he said, come on over. And I had my last show at one station on a Sunday, and people on the listener line are saying, next week we're going to be on. And the next week I was on another station. So most of my station changes were fairly seamless, but I had a lot of them.
Barry Scott taking a stand.
Man, he's lucky to be able to have those connections and move around.
On our next episode with Barry, part 2 of 4, Barry reveals how so many music publications get artist facts wrong, including the real story around Captain and Tennille's wedding day, how the Lost 45 show is produced with his thousands of audio clips and train wreck segues, the day he decided to go national, his interviews with Beach Boy Brian Wilson, Cher, and how his conversation with Smokey Robinson landed a call from Aretha Franklin, and how a Whitney Houston tribute almost got him fired.
You can follow us, stream, and download every episode of AirCheck on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play AirCheck Podcast. If you haven't done so, give us a great rating. We'd also love to hear from you on our Facebook page, AirCheck Me.
This is Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Paul Kelly.
We'll talk to you soon.
Closing out another episode of AirCheck, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities. If you have radio stories to share, we'd love to hear from you. Join the AirCheck guest list. Email aircheckme@gmail.com. Musical props are Chris Gordon's. Announcer props, I'll take those. Greg O'Brien, the OB. AirCheck is available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play AirCheck Podcast. AirCheck is the creation of RDPK Productions.